The map was supposed to be a secret. Marshal Nathan Hudson had carried that knowledge like a brand against his chest for 3 years, a scar that never healed, a root burned into his memory and nowhere else, because he had trusted no one, told no one, shown no one the winding canyon path that cut through Devil's Throat Gorge and came out the other side of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He had walked it twice in the dead of winter, and once in the blazing teeth of August, always alone, always at night, always without leaving a single mark or record. The route was the only advantage he had over the Harlan gang, the only ace he had not yet played, and it was going to be the thing that ended this particular blood-soaked chapter of the New Mexico Territory once and for all. And then the woman crouched down in the red dirt outside the jailhouse, picked up a stick no thicker than her smallest finger and drew it. Not approximately, not in rough guessing strokes, precisely. She drew every bend, every narrow choke point, every false trail that forked left toward the rocks and went nowhere, the exact place where the creek crossed beneath the canyon floor, and created that hidden shelf of mud that could swallow a horse whole if a rider did not know to angle 30 degrees northwest before the second cottonwood tree. She drew it all in about 40 seconds without looking up at him once, and when she finished, she set the stick down with a faint click against a pebble and folded her hands in her lap like a schoolteacher waiting for a pupil to catch up. Nathan Hudson stood above her with his jaw locked and his heart hammering and a cold, terrible awareness moving through him like floodwater through a gulch. Someone had followed him. Someone had memorized everything he had done in the dark. And that someone was this woman, this slender, dark-eyed, infuriating woman with dust on her collar and blood on her sleeve, and the calmest expression he had ever seen on a person who was sitting 3 feet from a man who had the legal authority to hang her. "You going to say something?" Winifred Wells asked, looking up at him now, her voice carrying that particular tone of patience that was so thoroughgoing it circled back around and became its own kind of contempt. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the map in the sand and then at her. "Who are you?" he finally said, and it came out rougher and more raw than he intended, less like a lawman asking a prisoner her name, and more like a man asking a question he was not sure he wanted answered. She tilted her head slightly. The evening light fell across her cheekbone and the set of her jaw, and for one singular, destabilizing second he saw not a threat but something else entirely, something that frightened him in a completely different and far more personal way. "I am the person who can get you through that gorge alive," Winifred Wells said, "and I am the person who will watch you die in it if you do not let me come along." That was how it began. 3 weeks earlier, the town of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, had been exactly the kind of town that looked peaceful from a distance. In the year 1883, Cimarron sat along the Cimarron River at the base of the eastern edge of the Sangre de Cristo Range, and it had the outward appearance of a settlement that had decided to grow up and behave itself after a particularly rowdy youth. There was a church with a real glass window, 2 mercantile stores, a hotel that served actual food on china plates, and a schoolhouse that had been operating for 4 years. The territorial legislature had sent funding, ranchers had brought cattle, and a few families from Missouri and Kansas had arrived with enough determination and enough tools to build something permanent. None of that meant Cimarron was safe. It had never been safe. The mountains above it were full of hidden things, and the men who moved through those mountains had no interest in glass windows or china plates. Silas Harlan and his gang had been operating in the territory for 6 years. In those 6 years, they had robbed 7 stagecoaches, 4 banks, 2 mining company payroll shipments, and had committed an assortment of other crimes that the territorial newspapers listed with a combination of horror and a barely concealed fascination that Nathan found genuinely insulting. Harlan was not romantic. He was not a folk hero. He was a calculating, brutal man who was very good at one specific thing, which was disappearing into those mountains after every job and staying disappeared until the marshals and the hired bounty hunters and the army gave up and went home. The mountains were his true partner, and that partnership had kept him alive and free for 6 years. Nathan Hudson had been appointed United States Marshal for the Cimarron District 8 months ago, transferred from the Colorado Territory at the specific request of the district judge, who had written a letter to the federal office in Santa Fe describing Harlan's continued operation as a, quote, festering wound in the body of territorial law, unquote. The judge wanted someone with a particular combination of qualities, someone who understood mountain terrain, who had experience with tracking in high-altitude wilderness, who was not from the region and therefore not tangled in the complicated web of loyalty and fear that kept local lawmen from pushing too hard. Nathan had arrived in Cimarron on a gray February morning, with his star pinned to his coat, his horse loaded with enough gear to spend a week in the field, and a reputation that preceded him by about 20 miles in every direction. He was 34 years old, built like a man who had spent his life in physical work, with broad shoulders and hands that showed every hard year of that work in their calluses and scars. He had a face that women sometimes described as serious and men sometimes described as hard, and he had a habit of studying a room when he entered it that had saved his life on 3 separate occasions. He did not smile easily or talk much, and what talking he did was direct to the point of occasionally offending people, which he had long ago decided to accept as the cost of being a person who did not have time for the elaborate social performance of pretending things were other than what they were. He had set about learning the mountains with the same methodical intensity he brought to everything else. He had hired a local guide for the first month, an older Ute man named Thomas Runs Deer, who knew the range better than anyone, and he had listened and walked and asked questions and taken nothing for granted. Thomas had shown him trails and watersheds and seasonal routes, and then Thomas had gotten sick with a fever in March that kept him bedbound for weeks, and Nathan had continued on his own, developing that particular talent he had for looking at landscape and understanding it the way other men read a page of text, seeing the logic and grammar of it, the way water and elevation and rock formed a kind of language. The route through Devil's Throat Gorge was the discovery of the Gorge's 3rd visit. He had not been looking for it the first 2 times. He had gone in from the southern approach, mapped what he could see, and turned back. On the 3rd visit he had gone further north and found the narrow channel that cut east at a point where the canyon wall looked solid and impassable, and beyond that channel the path that threaded through boulder fields and dropped into the hidden valley on the Harlan side of the range. The valley where, Thomas had mentioned before his illness, there was a settlement of some kind that the gang used as a base. Nathan had told no one. He had not even written it down. The route represented a potential ambush position of considerable strategic value, and he intended to use it at a moment of maximum advantage when Harlan's full gang was likely to be present. A moment like the one approaching now, the mining company payroll shipment that was coming through the territory in 3 weeks, the one that Harlan's informants would certainly tell him about, that Harlan would certainly plan to rob, and that Nathan intended to let him attempt, then pursue him through the gorge while Harlan believed he was safely hidden in his mountain fortress. It was a good plan. Nathan was proud of it in the quiet, private way. He was proud of things that had taken genuine intellectual effort and risk to construct. He had shared the bare outlines of the operation with his 2 deputy marshals, telling them only their roles without revealing the route, because he trusted his deputies with their lives but not necessarily with their mouths after 2 drinks at the saloon, which brought him back to the problem of Winifred Wells and the map in the sand, because if she knew the route, she might not be the only one who knew it, and the entire plan might already be compromised. He had first encountered Winifred Wells 3 days earlier under circumstances that were, to be fair, unusual even by the standards of a marshal's work in the New Mexico territory. He had been riding back along the Cimarron River Road from an inspection of the ranching properties on the north end of his district, making notes about fencing and water access disputes that were beginning to heat up as the summer dried out the smaller creeks. It was late afternoon, and the light was doing that specific golden thing it did in the territory in early June, where everything took on a kind of fierce clarity that made shadows look painted and the mountains look close enough to touch. He had rounded a bend in the road and pulled up sharply because there was a horse standing loose in the road, a good quality roan mare with an empty saddle and a broken girth strap trailing in the dust. About 30 feet ahead, at the edge of the riverbank, a woman was crouched on one knee in the muddy sand, doing something with her hands that he could not quite see from his position. His hand went to his revolver by instinct, not drawing it, just touching the grip, because a loose horse on a road could mean trouble of several kinds. He walked his horse slowly forward until he could see more clearly, and what he saw was not what he expected. The woman was reading the ground. Reading it in the specific, technical, expert way that he associated with the best trackers he had ever seen. Men like Thomas runs deer, and one or two others who treated the surface of the earth like a text full of information that most people were simply not educated enough to decode. She was moving her fingertips along a set of boot tracks in the mud at the river's edge, and she was doing it with a kind of focused precision that made him pull up completely and watch. She seemed to become aware of him after about 30 seconds, not startled, not jumping up in alarm, just turning her head and looking at him with those dark eyes that seemed to be processing him the same way she had been processing the tracks, cataloging him, evaluating the data. "Your horse has a loose shoe on the left front," she said, by way of greeting. He had looked down at his horse's left front hoof, and she was correct. He had not noticed it. "You hurt?" he asked. "Not particularly," she said, which he would come to understand was a very Winifred answer, precise and slightly evasive in a way that technically answered the question while leaving significant amounts of information unshared. She stood up, dusting her hands on her trousers, and he registered several things in rapid sequence. She was wearing trousers and a man's work shirt, both travel-stained but of good quality. She was somewhere in her late 20s, he guessed, though there was a quality to her stillness that made her seem both younger and older than any specific age. She had dark hair pinned up with what appeared to be functional indifference, and her hands, now that she had stopped using them as instruments of examination, she tucked into her pockets with a kind of easy confidence that most women in the territory in 1883 did not carry, because most women in the territory in 1883 had been systematically taught that ease and confidence were luxuries they could not afford. "Girth snapped," she said, nodding at the mare. "I came off clean. I was checking to see if someone had crossed the river here in the last hour." "Had they?" he asked, because her certainty about the shoe had bought her at least that much professional curiosity. "Two riders," she said. "One of them on a horse with a distinctive wear pattern on the right rear shoe, like the horse favors its right hip slightly, probably an old injury. They went across heading northeast." She paused. "The taller one walks with a limp when he's off his horse. You can see where he stepped down before crossing. He puts his weight on his left foot, right comes down at an angle." Nathan stared at her for a moment. "How do you know he's taller?" "Stride length in the tracks, longer than average by about 3 inches. He looked at the river crossing point. He could barely see the tracks from where he sat on horseback. She had been reading them from 3 feet away, kneeling in mud, for about 45 seconds. "Who are you looking for?" he asked. And there it was, the first of the hidden things, because she paused in a way that was just slightly too deliberate, a pause that was not uncertainty but calculation. "Lost horses," she said. "I'm helping a rancher on the North Range recover some stolen stock." It was a plausible answer. It was even possibly true. He did not believe it was the whole truth, but he was not yet in a position to press her on it because he did not know enough yet. "I'm Marshal Nathan Hudson," he said. "Cimarron District." Something moved across her face. It was quick and controlled, and he nearly missed it, but he was a man who had spent years watching faces for exactly these small private performances of suppressed reaction, and he filed it away carefully. "Winifred Wells," she said. "I appreciate the introduction, Marshal." He helped her with the horse, or rather he held the mare's head while she jury-rigged a repair on the girth strap using a piece of rawhide from her saddlebag, working with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this or something like it many times. She remounted without assistance, which he had offered and she had ignored. "Northeast," she said, looking at the river. "They're moving fast. I need to go." "Which rancher are you working for?" he asked, because it was his district and he needed to know. She looked at him. That evaluating look again, the one that made him feel like a set of tracks being read. "Garrett," she said. "Peter Garrett on the North Range." He knew Peter Garrett. He would ask Garrett about this. She rode off northeast along the river, and he watched her go with a specific feeling he had learned to pay attention to. A prickling at the back of his neck that his years of experience had taught him was not paranoia, but information. His accumulated understanding of people and situations processing something his conscious mind had not yet named. He rode directly to Peter Garrett's ranch the next morning. Garrett was a weathered, honest man with 700 cattle and a persistent problem with water rights, and he looked genuinely puzzled when Nathan described the woman. "No," Garrett said. "No, I've got no one working for me tracking horses. I haven't lost any stock since February." So she had lied. The question was why and what the truth was, and Nathan had a working theory by the time he rode back into Cimarron. He put the word out quietly, the way he did things that he did not want to become common knowledge, through the hotel proprietor and the telegraph office clerk, and the one saloon bartender he trusted, which was to say he asked people to let him know if they saw or heard anything about a woman traveling alone matching his description. He went back to his regular work, which in the week preceding the planned operation consisted primarily of maintaining the appearance of normal routine, so that Harlan's informants would have nothing to report to their employer. He had 3 informants of his own inside the network that fed information to Harlan. He knew this because he had spent 4 months quietly and methodically identifying them, a process that had involved considerable patience and the cultivation of approximately 15 conversations in saloons and general stores, and at church socials that he attended in a spirit of pure professional strategy. He did not share the location or even the existence of his route through the gorge with his informants, because any information he gave them would reach Harlan within days, and the route was too valuable to risk. On the second day after meeting Winifred Wells, his deputy, a young man named Calvin Oates who was 26 and enthusiastic and genuinely good at his job despite a tendency to talk too much, came to the marshal's office with a piece of information. "Woman at the hotel," Calvin said, dropping into the chair across from Nathan's desk with the air of someone delivering something interesting. "Checked in yesterday, paid cash for a week. Goes by the name Wells. The hotel man says she came in with good saddlebags and a rifle that looked well used and well maintained, and she asked him 2 questions when she checked in." "Which were?" Nathan said, not looking up from the report he was writing. "1. Where was the closest place to buy ammunition for a .44 caliber rifle? 2. Whether Marshal Hudson was a man who could be bought." Nathan put down his pen. Calvin nodded with the expression of a man who appreciates that he has achieved an effect. "Mr. Pennock told her that in his personal opinion you were the most incorruptible man in the district, possibly in the territory, and she thanked him and paid for an extra blanket." "What did Pennock make of her?" "Says she's not a working girl. Says she talks like an educated woman, real precise-like, but she wears trail clothes and she's got calluses like a working person. He said she smelled like horse and river water, and he thought that was funny for a woman checking into his hotel, but she left a good tip." Nathan thought about this. A woman with trail skills and calluses who asked about ammunition and about whether the local marshal could be bought was someone with a specific mission. The question of what that mission was had become somewhat urgent. He found her the next afternoon. He had checked the saloon and the mercantile and the telegraph office. And then, on a particular hunch, he walked to the north end of town, where there was a small area of open ground between the last building and the start of the river Cottonwoods. It was a quiet spot, used mostly by children in the afternoons, and it was quiet at this time of day because the children were in school. Winifred Wells was sitting on a low boulder at the edge of the open ground with a notebook open on her knee and a pencil in her hand, writing with rapid concentration. Beside her on the boulder was a leather document case, old and worn, with initials stamped into it that he could not read from his distance. She heard him coming or sensed him because she closed the notebook before he was close enough to see what was in it. "Marshal," she said, without particular surprise. "Miss Wells," he said, "I'd like to have a conversation." "I assumed you would eventually," she said. She closed the document case and set both it and the notebook on the boulder beside her, which he interpreted as a territorial gesture. "These are mine. This space is mine. I'm not going to stand up and make myself smaller because you have arrived." He sat down on a nearby rock because standing over a seated person during a conversation was a dominance gesture he used when he needed it and not otherwise. "Peter Garrett says he didn't hire you," he said. "No," she said, "he didn't. So you lied." "Yes," she said, without apparent embarrassment. "I gave you a name that would sound plausible and would take you a day or two to check. I needed time." "Time for what?" he asked. She looked at him carefully. He had the sense that she was making a decision, running through its implications at the speed of someone accustomed to making rapid evaluations under conditions of uncertainty. "Do you know the name Harlan?" she asked. "I know several Harlans," he said, because this was a test and he was not going to offer information freely. "Which one?" "Silas Harlan," she said. "The man whose gang has been robbing stages and payroll shipments in this territory for 6 years. "I'm familiar with him," Nathan said, with the deliberate understatement of a man who had spent 8 months of his life almost entirely focused on bringing that particular individual to justice. "He killed my father," Winifred Wells said, and her voice did not change when she said it. That was the part that hit him hardest, not the words but the steadiness of the voice, the indication that she had said this sentence so many times in her own head that the saying of it out loud had become almost entirely mechanical, grief worn down to a kind of factual precision. 2 years ago, in the Raton Pass area, my father was carrying a payroll for the Maxwell Land Grant Company. He was the company's surveyor and cartographer. He had done the route dozens of times. Harlan's men stopped the wagon, took the payroll box, and shot my father when he attempted to resist. He died 3 days later in Trinidad. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded, accepting this at face value without performing gratitude for it. "The Maxwell Company settled with my mother. There was no legal prosecution because by the time the authorities organized a response, Harlan was gone, back into the mountains." She paused. "I decided I would find him myself." "You a Pinkerton?" he asked. It was the most logical conclusion. "No," she said. "I'm my father's daughter. He was a cartographer and surveyor for 30 years. I grew up with maps. I learned to read terrain the way other people learn to read text. I have been in these mountains for the past 14 months mapping them." He stared at her. "14 months," he said. "14 months," she confirmed. "I have a complete map of the eastern Sangre de Cristo range from the Colorado border to the Mora Valley. Every trail, every water source, every habitation, every route through every pass and gorge that exists." She said this the way other people might say that they had learned to embroider or to play piano, as a statement of accomplished fact without particular vanity. Including the route through Devil's Throat Gorge. The moment hung between them with the specific weight of something irrevocable. He did not move. He did not change his expression, because he had trained himself out of involuntary expression to a degree that sometimes alarmed people. But inside his chest, something had shifted in a way that was both alarming and, against every professional instinct he possessed, almost exhilarating. "How long have you known about the route?" he asked. "I mapped it in October," she said. "7 months ago. I discovered your tracks in the gorge in February when I went back to update my notes on the spring water levels. I knew they were yours because they were single set, made by a man of your approximate weight, moving without a pack animal, and the tracks showed someone who knew what they were doing in mountain terrain. I had heard by then that the new marshal was making serious efforts to understand the range, so I began paying attention." "You tracked me," he said. "I observed evidence of your movements," she said, which was the same thing dressed in more precise language. "I was not following you in the field. I was reading the signs you left behind. Which tells me," he said slowly, "that if you could read those signs, someone else could." "Yes," she said. "Which is one of the things I came to Cimarron to tell you." He said nothing. He was recalibrating. The entire internal architecture of the operation he had built, the careful, patient plan he had constructed over months, was suddenly and entirely differently lit. The way a room looks different when you open a curtain you had assumed was covering a wall and discover it is covering a window. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want Silas Harlan in custody," she said. "Or dead, but I understand that you have professional and legal constraints around that preference, so I will accept custody." She said this with a perfectly straight face. "And I want to be the one who gets him there. I want to be part of the operation. I have information you cannot access any other way, and I have skills in this specific terrain that would genuinely improve your chances of success. I'm not asking for your gratitude or for any kind of official recognition. I want to be there when he is taken. That is what I want." He thought about it for 3 full seconds, which was a long time for him, and he said, "No." She had expected this. He could see that she had expected it. She did not argue. She simply stood up, picked up her notebook and document case, and said, "I'll be at the hotel for another 5 days. I hope you'll reconsider." And then she walked away, and he watched her go again, and the prickling at the back of his neck was different this time. Still information, but the information was different now. He reconsidered for 48 hours, which was longer than he wanted to admit. He reconsidered while reading reports, and while riding the circuit, and while eating breakfast alone at the hotel dining room, which was where Winifred Wells also ate breakfast, at a separate table, with her notebook open beside her plate, writing in it with the focused absorption of a person for whom eating was a biological requirement to be addressed efficiently so that more important things could resume. He noticed her. He noticed her in a way that was increasingly inconvenient for a man who prided himself on focused professional attention, because she was the kind of person who drew attention, not through conventional means, but through the sheer unmistakable quality of her mind in action, which was visible even across a hotel dining room in the specific way her pencil moved, and the way she occasionally paused to look at nothing in particular, which he understood as the look of a person actively processing a large amount of spatial information in their head. On the second morning, he sat down across from her at her table without being invited, which was rude and he knew it, and she looked up from her notebook with an expression that said she recognized this as an olive branch in the slightly blunt form of a person who did not particularly deal in social graces. "Tell me what you know about the settlement in the valley behind the gorge," he said. She told him. She told him for 1 hour and 40 minutes, and by the time she was done his coffee was cold and untouched, and he had not looked away from her face, except to examine the 2 small maps she had produced from the document case and spread on the table between the plates, drawn in a precise hand that he recognized immediately as cartographic training, the notation system, the scale markers, the elevation lines, all the professional language of someone who had done this work seriously for years. The settlement was larger than he had imagined. 11 structures, some permanent, some seasonal, water supply from a spring on the north side, a corral capable of holding 20 horses. Two approaches, the Gorge route and a southern approach that was longer and more exposed but passable. Harlan kept 4 men at the settlement at all times and rotated others through. She had counted 12 distinct individuals over the course of her observations, conducted across 4 separate visits over 14 months, each visit taking several days, always alone. "You went into that valley alone," he said. 12 armed men. "Observation only," she said. "I went in at dawn and watched from the rock formation on the northeast ridge. I was very still. I am very good at being still." He believed her entirely. "How close did you get?" "Close enough to read the brands on the horses," she said. He stared at her, and then he said something he almost never said to anyone, something that cost him a particular kind of professional pride to say, which was, "I need your help." She looked at him with those dark, evaluating eyes, and then, for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was the smile of a person who had been waiting a long time to hear something that had finally been said. "Then we have work to do," Winifred Wells said. They began meeting in the evenings at the marshal's office after his deputies had gone, which Calvin Oates noticed with an expression that Nathan informed him was none of his business, and which Calvin responded to with a suppressed smile that Nathan also informed him was none of his business. It was not what Calvin Oates was implying. Or rather, it was not only that, and the only part Nathan was willing to examine at any given moment was the professional part, because the professional part was real and urgent and required genuine focus. She spread her maps on his desk and they sat across from each other, and she walked him through everything she knew about the valley settlement. And then he told her things he had not told anyone else, about the informant network and the timing of the payroll shipment and the plan he had been building. They argued because she had opinions about every element of the plan, strong and clearly expressed opinions delivered in that precise voice, and he pushed back, and she pushed back harder, and twice in the first evening she said something that made him stop mid-sentence and sit back and accept, somewhat grudgingly, that she was right. She was right about the timing of the second approach team, which he had planned to send too early. She was right about the corral, which he had planned to ignore, and which she pointed out was actually the strategic center of the settlement because without horses the gang lost their primary advantage. "You think like a tactician," he said on the third evening, which surprised her. He could see that she had not expected it. "My father had military manuals," she said. "He used them to understand territory the way armies used it for his survey work. I grew up reading them alongside the cartography texts." "Your father sounds like a remarkable man," he said. Her expression changed. It was a small change, quickly controlled, but it was real. "He was," she said. "He taught me that the most valuable thing a person can understand is where they are, precisely where they are, in space, on the earth. He said most people go through their entire lives without knowing where they actually are, and that was a kind of blindness he could not abide." Nathan thought about that. He thought about the way he had come to understand landscape, the way he looked at terrain and read it like language, and he thought that Winifred Wells's father had given her something worth more than most of the things parents gave their children. "How old were you when he died?" he asked. He did not usually ask personal questions, but in the context of what she had just said it felt like the natural next thing. 26, she said. "I'm 28 now." He had guessed close. "And you have been doing this for 2 years, he said, not a question. 14 months in the field, she said. The first 10 months were preparation, research, equipment, learning the specific terrain differences between the Sangre de Cristo Range and the Colorado Rockies where I grew up. I made mistakes in the first few months. There were 2 occasions when I was careless and nearly got into serious trouble." She said this with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of a person reviewing their own errors professionally. "I learned from them. I was more careful after." "Nearly got into trouble how?" he asked. "Once, a Harlan rider came much closer to my observation position than I expected, and I had to lie in a creek bed for approximately 4 hours without moving," she said. The other time I misjudged the speed of a storm coming off the ridge and had to take shelter in a shallow cave for 2 days with very little water." She paused. "I know the Ute word for thank you because I met a Ute woman during that incident who shared her water with me. She thought I was probably somewhat unhinged, but she was very generous." Despite himself, Nathan laughed. It was a real laugh, unexpected, and it seemed to surprise both of them. She looked at him with an expression of brief startlement that resolved into something warmer, and he looked away at the maps on the desk, because the warmth in her expression was the kind of thing that required looking away from. The plan developed over 6 more evenings. They built it together, genuinely together, in a way that Nathan had never worked with anyone on anything professional, because he was by nature and by habit a person who planned alone. But the plan they built together was substantially better than the one he had planned alone, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize this even while it was slightly uncomfortable to do so. The payroll shipment would move through on a Thursday in late June. They expected Harlan to hit it on the stretch of road east of the mountains, then retreat through the gorge with the money. Nathan would have his 2 deputies and 3 additional men from the district positioned to pursue immediately, and he and Winifred would go through the gorge route ahead of them, faster because they had the advantage of the secret path, and because Winifred could navigate it at a pace that would allow them to reach the valley settlement ahead of Harlan's returning men. He had argued about this, the them, the we, the joint entry. He had argued that she was a civilian and that the gorge approach was the most dangerous element of the operation, and that he could not be responsible for putting her in that position. She had listened to this argument with the patience she brought to everything, and then she had said, "You cannot navigate the approach quickly enough without me, and speed is the decisive factor in whether you reach that valley before Harlan does or after. Without me leading you through the creek crossing, and the boulder field approaches, you will be an hour slower than you need to be, and Harlan will arrive at the settlement first and fortify. You will then be attacking a fortified position with 7 men, which is a different kind of risk entirely." He had known she was right. He had known it while she was still saying it, which was part of why it was aggravating. "Fine," he had said. "But you are not to be in a front position when we enter the valley. You are to stay back." "I will stay in whatever position makes tactical sense," she had said, with the serene inflexibility of someone who had had this conversation in their head long before it happened and had already won it. They spent the days before the operation in increasingly blurred professional proximity that was becoming something else in a way neither of them had commented on or intended, and yet could not be mistaken for anything but what it was. He found reasons to be where she was. She found reasons to show him things, a specific canyon formation, a particular reading of the ground, a passage from one of the military manuals she had apparently memorized in substantial portions, which she quoted to illustrate tactical points, and then looked at him with that slight challenging tilt of her head that asked whether he understood. He understood. He understood all of it, the tactics and the quoted texts and the thing underneath both of those, the conversation they were having in the space between the professional planning, which was also a conversation about 2 people who were, despite everything they knew about the danger of this particular situation, finding each other with a kind of inevitability that felt less like choice and more like geography, like terrain that had its own logic. Like a path that, once you found it, turned out to be the only path that made sense. He found her one morning at the river, doing what she had been doing when he first saw her, reading the ground. She was tracking something along the bank, moving slowly, and she had not heard him approach because he could move quietly when he chose to, a skill learned in the field, and he stood at the edge of the cottonwoods and watched her for a moment that was longer than strictly necessary. She was in her element. That was the thing that struck him. She moved through the world in a specific way when she was doing this work, with a kind of unself-conscious ease, All the precision and formality she carried in conversation replaced by something fluid and physical, a full-body engagement with the information the ground was giving her. She was beautiful. He registered this not as a distraction but as a fact, the same category of fact as the route through the gorge or the number of structures in the valley, something true about the world that had to be accounted for. She looked up and found him watching and did not startle or flush or perform embarrassment. "Mountain lion came through last night," she said, "following the deer trail. Young one, maybe 2 years based on the paw size, heading north." She straightened up. "You're not sleeping," he blinked. "Excuse me." "You have the look of a person who isn't sleeping enough," she said. "The operation is in 4 days. You need to rest." "I rest fine," he said, which was approximately 70% true. "You're running through the valley approach in your head," she said. "You keep coming back to the eastern corral because you can't decide whether to take it first or let it go and take the main structure first." He stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm doing the same thing," she said. They stood at the river in the early morning light with the cottonwood leaves moving above them and the water running clear over the stones, and the distance between them was about 6 feet and felt considerably smaller than that. "Take the corral first," she said, quietly. "If they can't reach the horses, they can't run. Everything else follows from that." "I know," he said. "I decided that last night." "Good," she said, and then in a different tone, softer and more careful, she said, "Nathan." It was the first time she had used his name without the title. It landed differently than he expected. "You should know something," she said. "Before we go in there, I want you to know that this is not only about my father anymore." She met his eyes. "It started as that, and that matters, and it will always matter. But somewhere in the last 3 weeks it became something else as well. Something I want you to know exists. I am not asking you to do anything with that information except to know it." He stood very still. He was not a man who received this kind of declaration often, or who knew how to receive it gracefully, and he was aware that this was one of those moments where the right response mattered in a way that went beyond strategy or planning. "I know," he said finally. "I know because I am having the same problem." She smiled then, and it was different from the previous smile, less controlled, more genuine, and it did something to the region of his chest that he was going to have to think about carefully later. "Then we have something to come back for," she said, "both of us." They did not say anything else about it. They went back to the planning, and to the final preparations, and to the careful, focused days of making sure everything was in its correct position. But the thing they had acknowledged was there now, present and warm and carefully set aside to be attended to when there was time, when the work was done, when Silas Harlan was no longer a threat to anyone. The morning of the operation, Nathan met his deputies, and the 3 additional men he had sworn in from the district. Good, solid men who ranched and knew the territory and could be trusted to follow a plan. He gave them their instructions, checked their horses and equipment, and told them the simplified version of the pursuit plan, which was that, when Harlan's gang retreated into the mountains after the robbery, they were to follow at full speed on the main canyon approach while Nathan came from a different direction. He did not tell them Winifred would be there. He told Calvin Oates separately, because Calvin had figured most of it out already, and lying to him would have been both ineffective and insulting. "She knows what she's doing," Nathan said. "I know," Calvin said. "I've watched her track twice. She's better than Thomas Runs Deer, Marshal, and I thought Thomas Runs Deer was the best I'd ever seen." "Keep that observation to yourself," Nathan said. Calvin kept his expression very carefully neutral. "Of course, sir." He met Winifred at the North Canyon entrance at 4 in the morning in the dark, with a half moon and the stars doing the kind of extraordinary thing they did in the high desert at altitude, burning so thick and bright they cast faint shadows. She was already there when he arrived, which he expected, and her horse was ready, and her equipment was organized with the compact efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they needed and had no patience for anything else. She had a .44 caliber rifle, as the hotel man had reported, a well-used Winchester model 1873 that she carried in a saddle scabbard with the ease of a person to whom the firearm was a tool like any other tool. She had a revolver at her hip, also .44 caliber, matching ammunition. He noted this without comment because it was professional and sensible, and because he had decided 3 days ago to stop being surprised by the things she was professional and sensible about. They went into the gorge in silence. She led and he followed, and he watched her navigate the darkness with a kind of controlled confidence that had nothing of recklessness in it, each decision made from knowledge rather than instinct, or rather from knowledge that had become instinct through repetition. She took the false left fork and went straight past it without hesitating. She found the creek crossing and angled northwest exactly as he had done, and he measured the angle against his own memory, and it was within 5 degrees, which was essentially perfect in the dark. Through the boulder field she went slightly slower, reading the path by feel and by the faint light, and twice she put her hand back without looking at him in a gesture that meant wait, and he stopped and waited and both times heard, after a few seconds, the small sounds that had told her to pause, a loose rock settling, the distant sound of something moving that turned out to be a night bird. They came out into the valley at an hour before dawn, which was almost exactly when they had planned to arrive. The settlement was dark and quiet below them, 11 structures as she had mapped, a handful of lights visible only in one window of the main building. They tied the horses at the tree line and went on foot, and Nathan put his hand on her arm lightly to slow her as they came to the position where the plan said she would stop. "Here," he said very quietly. She looked at the corral and at the main structure and at the positions he had planned. Then she looked at him, and in the faint pre-dawn light he could see her expression. "The window with the light," she said, barely audible. "2 men inside. The others are in the secondary structure on the right. Harlan sleeps in the main building back room." "How do you know?" he breathed. "I watched this settlement for 4 days in March," she said. "Harlan does not change his habits easily." He processed this. "You are to stay at this position," he said, and she met his eyes and gave him a slight nod that accepted the instruction without fully committing to it, and he knew that was the best he was going to get. He moved toward the corral. He went wide and low, circling around to come at it from the back where there was a section of fence that could be opened quietly, and he worked the gate latch by feel in the dark, which took 2 full minutes of controlled patience. And then the gate swung open and he moved the horses out into the valley, walking them slowly toward the tree line, 4 of them, then 6, then 8, until the corral held only 2 horses that were too deep in sleep to easily move. He got back to Winifred's position as the sky was starting to shift from black to deep blue at the eastern edge. "Harlan's coming," she said. He heard it then, what she had already heard. Horses on the gorge approach, the main approach from the south that his deputies were following. Harlan was making excellent time, which meant the robbery had gone quickly, which meant they had arrived at the valley with approximately 40 minutes less margin than planned. The next hour was the most controlled chaos Nathan had experienced in 8 months of work in the territory. His deputies came in from the south exactly when they were supposed to, the sound of them alerting the settlement before the valley's inhabitants could organize properly. The gang came in from the gorge, Harlan's men, finding the corral empty and beginning to shout, and in the resulting confusion Nathan moved from point to point with the specific economy of motion of a man who has thought through every step in advance, and is now executing the plan against reality, which requires adjustments but has enough margin built in to accommodate them. Silas Harlan came out of the main building and immediately assessed the situation with the tactical intelligence of a man who had survived 6 years by being quick, and he went straight for the 2 horses still in the corral. Nathan was between him and them before Harlan completed the thought, his revolver drawn and his badge showing. "United States Marshal," Nathan said. "You are under arrest." Harlan looked at him and at the situation around them and made the calculation that most men in his position made at that point, which was that the calculation had already been lost. He put his hands up. He was, Nathan would tell the district judge later, a man who understood arithmetic. 3 of Harlan's men attempted resistance of various kinds. Calvin Oates handled one of them with a competence that Nathan noted for the deputy's record with satisfaction. The district men handled the other 2 without injury to anyone, which was a better outcome than Nathan had dared to hope for. The total operation, from the first alarm to the last man in restraints, took 42 minutes. When it was over, when his deputies were beginning the process of binding prisoners and accounting for everyone present, Nathan turned and walked back to the tree line where he had left Winifred. She was not precisely where he had left her. She was 20 feet further forward, at the edge of the nearest building, where she had clearly moved to cover the secondary structure during the operation. She had her Winchester at her shoulder and was watching the structure's door with the absolute stillness she had described as one of her skills. One of the men from the secondary structure had apparently thought better of coming out and had remained inside, and she had kept him there, alone, for 40 minutes, by the simple method of being very still and very present, and making it very clear through posture alone that coming out through that door would be a decision with immediate consequences. Nathan walked up beside her. "There's one inside," she said, her voice still and steady, rifle still at her shoulder. "He's been trying to decide for about 10 minutes. He's scared." "Good," Nathan said, and he raised his voice to address the closed door. "This is United States Marshal Nathan Hudson. Everyone else in your party is in custody. Come out with your hands up and you will not be harmed." A silence of about 30 seconds. Then the door opened slowly and a young man, barely more than a boy, 19 at most, came out with his hands high and his face showing the specific expression of someone who has made a very bad set of decisions and is now fully aware of this. Winifred lowered the Winchester and set it back in the saddle scabbard, and she turned and looked at Nathan, and he looked at her. And the morning was fully arrived now, the sun coming up over the eastern range and flooding the valley with clear gold light, and she had dust in her hair and a slightly rueful expression, and she was the most remarkable person he had ever stood next to in the morning light in a New Mexico valley, while 12 criminals were being put into restraints behind them. "Take the corral first," he said. "You already knew," she said. "I knew," he said, "but I needed to hear you say it." She looked at him for a long moment. He reached out and did something he had not planned to do, which was that he tucked one loose strand of hair back from her face with the same kind of careful precision with which she did everything, and she went very still under his hand the way still water goes still when something touches the surface. "We have to ride back to Cimarron," he said. "Yes," she said. "And then there will be prisoners to process and reports to write, and the district judge to contact, and probably a week of extremely tedious procedural work." "I know," she said. "And after that," he said carefully, "I have something I would like to ask you." She looked at him with those eyes, that reading look, and read everything that was there. "After that," she agreed. The ride back to Cimarron took most of the day. 12 prisoners on horses with his deputies and district men was a slow business even with everything organized, and Nathan was simultaneously managing the practical logistics of the movement and the internal experience of something having fundamentally and irrevocably shifted in him, which required its own kind of management. He rode beside Winifred for most of the return journey. They talked, not about the operation, which was over, and not about the other thing, which was waiting, but about everything in between. She told him about growing up in Colorado, in Denver, in a house full of maps and survey equipment, and the smell of India ink, with a father who took her into the field every summer from the time she was 8, and a mother who taught school and read widely, and had opinions about everything she read. She told him about the cartography apprenticeship she had completed at 18 with a survey company in Colorado Springs, the only woman they had ever taken, obtained by demonstrating in a practical examination that she could produce accurate survey maps of a provided area faster, and with more detail than any of the male candidates they had tested. "What did they do with you after the examination?" Nathan asked. "They had a long conversation that I was not party to," she said, with a slight dryness. "And then they took me, with the strong implication that I was to be an exception and not a precedent." She paused. "I spent 4 years with that company. I learned a great deal. I left because the company owner had decided that my work should appear in company publications without my name attached to it, on the grounds that a woman's name on a survey map would be taken less seriously by clients." "That is a significant injustice," Nathan said. "It is one I intend to correct eventually," she said. "I have excellent documentation of which maps are mine, but that is a later problem. I have other priorities at present." He was quiet for a moment. "Those priorities are resolved now," he said. "Harlan is in custody. What comes after?" She did not answer immediately. He watched her profile, the set of her jaw, the slight movement of thought working through her expression. "I have 14 months of maps of the eastern Sangre de Cristo Range," she said. "They have scientific and practical value. The Territorial Geological Survey Office has been asking for accurate maps of this region for years. I could offer them a complete set." She paused. "And I find that I am not eager to leave this particular district." He looked ahead at the road. "I find the same thing," he said. "About you leaving, I mean." She turned her head and looked at him. "I am 34 years old," he said. "I have spent my adult life in work that consumes everything by choice, because I believed that was what the work required. I am not sure I was wrong about that, because the work is genuinely important and it has required what I gave it. But I believe I was incomplete in my understanding of what else is important." He paused, and this was not the sort of speech he made, ever. And he was making it because he had concluded that she was the sort of person who deserved the full truth of a thing rather than its careful edited version. "You are the most formidable person I have ever worked beside, and I include in that comparison every colleague and partner and officer and tracker I have known in my professional life. And I am in the process of discovering that formidable is precisely the quality I find most compelling in a person, and that I have a specific and growing preoccupation with you that is nothing to do with professional regard." He stopped. "I said I would ask you something after. This is the precursor to that. I needed you to understand the context." She was quiet. They rode in silence for approximately half a mile, which was either a good sign or a terrible sign, and he could not determine which. "I have been alone for a long time," she said finally. "By choice, because the work required it, but also because the people I had encountered had not seemed to require the kind of honesty I had to give. Most people want something more manageable than I appear to be." She glanced at him, and there was something in that glance that was both honest and tentative. "You do not seem to find me unmanageable." "I find you completely unmanageable," he said. "I find that I do not mind." She laughed, and it was the best thing he had heard in the New Mexico territory in 8 months. Cimarron received them with the combination of relief and excitement that a small town in 1883 produced when its marshal returned with 12 prisoners and the end of a 6-year criminal operation. There was a considerable crowd at the edge of town, and Calvin Oates became something of a local hero before he had even dismounted, and the district judge, who had ridden in from Springer specifically to receive the report, shook Nathan's hand with a fervor that was almost embarrassing. In all of this, Winifred stayed at the edge, which Nathan observed from across the crowd with the specific awareness of someone tracking a particular person through a complex environment. She was watching with quiet satisfaction, not claiming any of it, but there was a quality to her stillness that was different from the stillness of someone who did not matter. It was the stillness of someone who knew what they had contributed and did not need the crowd's recognition of it. He got away from the judge and the crowd and the deputies and the general celebration as soon as decency permitted, and he found her at the hitching post in front of the hotel, seeing to her horse. "The judge wants to write a full report for Santa Fe," he said. "It will take me several days." "I know," she said, not looking up from the stirrup leather she was examining for wear. "After that," he said, and this was the part he had been organizing in his head for the last 4 hours of riding, "I would like you to have dinner with me, not at the hotel dining room." She looked up. "There is a restaurant in Cimarron that was opened last year by a family from New Orleans," he said. "I have never been because I did not have an occasion that warranted it. I believe this occasion warrants it." She looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once, pleasure and consideration and a slight careful amusement. "You are asking me to dinner," she said. "I am asking you to stay in Cimarron through next week," he said, "and to have dinner with me, and after that I will ask you other things progressively as circumstances allow." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said with perfect seriousness, "I accept the dinner. I am prepared to consider the progressive other things on their individual merits." He smiled, which was not something he did often, and it transformed his face in a way that made her look at him with an expression of slightly startled pleasure. "Good," he said. The dinner was, on reflection, the beginning of everything. It was a revelation in the specific form of a person across a table in candlelight eating good food, which neither of them had done in some time, and talking without the professional framework that had structured all their previous conversations. She told him about her mother, who was alive and well in Denver, and who had responded to the letter informing her of her daughter's plan to spend 14 months mapping criminal mountain hideouts with a combination of complete maternal alarm and, ultimately, complete maternal acceptance, because she had known her daughter long enough to understand that Winifred's determinations were final. "What did she think of the outcome?" he asked. "I sent a telegram this morning," Winifred said. "She will respond within 3 days, and her response will contain at least one question about whether I am safe, and at least one inquiry about whether there are any prospects in the area." She met his eyes with entirely composed mischief. "I intend to answer both in the affirmative." He looked at her over the table in the candlelight, at the quiet intelligence in her face and the self-possession that was not armor but genuine, an actual quality of being, and felt something settle inside him with the solidity of foundation stone. "Tell her yes," he said, "to both." They walked back to the hotel after dinner through the quiet Cimarron streets, the night air cool with the elevation and the mountains visible in the moonlight against the east, and at the hotel door he took her hand, which she allowed, and held it for a moment that was longer than a handshake and shorter than anything else, which she also allowed. "Thank you," he said. "For what specifically?" she asked. "For not leaving after I said no," he said. She smiled. "I was not going to leave," she said. "I knew you would change your mind. You are too good a strategist not to use the best available resource." "That's very flattering," he said. "I meant it practically," she said. "But I will accept flattery as a secondary interpretation." He laughed again, twice in one day, which was unprecedented, and she went inside, and he stood on the street for a moment looking at the mountains and the moon and the completely altered shape of what his life appeared to be becoming. The reports took 8 days. During those 8 days, Winifred submitted her maps to the Territorial Geological Survey Office through the district judge, who read them with growing astonishment, and immediately wrote to Santa Fe recommending that they be accepted and formally acknowledged as the most comprehensive mapping of the eastern Sangre de Cristo range currently in existence. He also recommended that the territory consider a consulting arrangement with Miss Wells, which he noted was not a title given to many women by federal authorities, but which he argued was entirely warranted by the quality of the work. Nathan watched this development with satisfaction, and with something else, which was pride, the specific pride of seeing someone recognized for what they actually were, which in his professional experience was a rarer occurrence than justice required. He had dinner with her 3 more times during the 8 days, and on the 4th dinner he asked her the next progressive thing, which was whether she intended to remain in the territory, and she said she did not know yet, that she had been considering whether a cartographic practice in Cimarron made professional sense, and that the territory was genuinely undermapped in the southern sections, and that there was real scientific work to be done. "I think it makes professional sense," he said. "On what grounds?" She asked, which was her way of asking him to be direct. "On the grounds that I would not like you to leave," he said, "and that I am developing intentions that would be substantially complicated by geography." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of intentions?" she asked. "Long-term ones," he said, "the specific kind that require discussion, but only when both parties are ready for the discussion." "I am ready for most discussions," she said. "Are you ready for this one?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet moment he could almost see her thinking, processing the situation with the same precision she brought to everything else, measuring the data she had and its implications. "I came to this territory for one reason," she said carefully, "and I accomplished that reason. And somewhere in the course of it I found something I was not looking for and did not plan for and cannot now imagine being without." She met his eyes. "That is not a statement I make lightly. I have not made it before. I want you to understand that the weight of it is real." "I understand it," he said, "and I am asking you to let me offer the same weight in return." She looked at him across the table in the candlelight of the New Orleans restaurant in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1883, and she said, "Yes." And he understood that this yes applied to all the questions simultaneously, the ones asked and the ones not yet asked, the present and the future, the territory and whatever came after, all of it in one clear word, the way she did everything, precisely and without qualification. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in September, in the church with the real glass window, Nathan Hudson married Winifred Wells. The district judge performed the ceremony. Calvin Oates stood as witness, and he managed to maintain the carefully neutral expression for approximately the first 2 minutes of the ceremony, before giving it up entirely and simply smiling with unguarded warmth for the rest of it. Winifred's mother, Eloisa Wells, had arrived on the stage from Trinidad 2 days before, and she sat in the front pew with the expression of a woman who had worried for 2 years and was now watching the worry resolve itself into something considerably better than she had dared to hope. The ring was gold, simple, from the jeweler in Springer who had 3 choices, and from whom Winifred had selected the plainest one, because it was the most functional and would not interfere with field work. Nathan had added a small inlaid design at her mother's suggestion, without telling Winifred, and when she saw it at the ceremony, she looked at it for a moment, and then looked at him with an expression that did something particular and wonderful to his heart. They had a wedding meal at the hotel, which Pennock the hotel man had organized with a ceremony that suggested he had been waiting for this specific occasion for some months. There were flowers, which surprised everyone including Pennock, who explained that a ranch wife from the North Range had brought them in specifically for the occasion when she had heard the date. Winifred's mother cornered Nathan briefly and told him with great directness that her daughter was the best and most difficult person she knew, that her late husband would have approved of him unreservedly, and that if Nathan ever gave her daughter reason to regret this day, she would personally make the journey from wherever she happened to be living to make her feelings on the matter known. He accepted this with the seriousness it deserved and told Eloisa Wells that he had no intention of giving her reason to make that journey, and she looked at him with eyes that were Winifred's eyes and said that she believed him, which was the highest endorsement she offered. They spent the first year of their marriage in Cimarron, Nathan continuing his work as marshal and Winifred establishing her cartographic practice, which expanded faster than either of them had anticipated, because the survey office in Santa Fe sent her 2 formal commissions within the first 6 months, and a mining company from Colorado heard about the maps and sent an inquiry about the southern Sangre de Cristo approaches that led to a 3rd commission and a payment that was, by the standards of 1883 in the territory, quite good. She built herself a working room in the house that Nathan had expanded with a 2nd room when it became clear that a marshal's office shared with a cartography practice was not going to survive the first winter without structural modification. The working room had a large table for spreading maps, a wall of shelves for her document cases, and a good north-facing window for the light quality she needed for detailed drafting. He built the shelves himself, and she supervised the construction with specific technical requirements about level and spacing that he followed exactly and without argument, which she noticed and appreciated more than she said. She was happy. He knew this not because she announced it, which was not her manner, but because he had become a student of her over the course of their marriage in the same way she was a student of terrain, learning to read the particular signs that communicated what she was feeling through the careful surface she habitually maintained. The signs were there. She laughed more. She touched his arm when she passed him in the working room. She brought him coffee without being asked, which for a woman of her independent habits was an act of considerable thoughtfulness. And sometimes in the evenings she would look up from her work across the table to where he was reading or writing his own reports, and catch him watching her, and the smile she gave him then was different from every other smile, private and complete and full of everything they had built. In the spring of 1885, almost 2 years after the morning in the valley, when Silas Harlan had put his hands up, their son was born. They named him Joseph Amos Hudson, after Nathan's father and Winifred's father, in that order, which was Winifred's suggestion, and which Nathan accepted with a feeling that sat somewhere in his chest and made it difficult to speak for a moment when she proposed it. Joseph was born on a Tuesday morning with Calvin Oates anxiously patrolling the street outside the house, because he had been sent away by the midwife and did not know what else to do with himself. Nathan was inside because Winifred had told him very firmly that she expected him to remain, which he had argued against on the grounds that it was not the custom, and she had pointed out that many customs were suboptimal, and that she was not going through this particular experience without him in the room, and he had stayed. The moment they placed Joseph in his arms was the most unbalancing moment of Nathan Hudson's adult life, and he was a man who had been in more than one life-threatening situation without losing his balance, but nothing had prepared him for 8 pounds of his and Winifred's combined existence looking up at him with ancient, unfocused eyes. Winifred watched him from the bed, exhausted and present and thoroughly herself. "He has your jaw," she said. "He has your nose," Nathan said, which he was not entirely sure was true but seemed like the right thing to say. "Good nose," she said, and closed her eyes, and Nathan held his son in the September morning light coming through the window and felt himself become, in some fundamental way, a different and larger person than he had been before. Calvin Oates was allowed in eventually, and spent approximately 15 minutes in a state of barely contained emotion before recovering his professional equilibrium. Eloisa Wells arrived on the next available stage from Trinidad, where she had relocated permanently to be closer to her daughter, and she held Joseph with the practiced ease of a woman who had once held a baby of her own and found her way back to it instantly. Life in Cimarron in 1885 and 1886 had a rhythm and a texture that Nathan would in later years describe, when asked what the best years of his life had been, as what everything before had been preparation for. He was still the marshal. He was still the same methodical, serious man he had always been, with the same approach to the work and the same standards for its execution. But he came home. He came home to the smell of ink and horse, and the particular sound Winifred made when she was working through a complex cartographic problem, a slight almost hum under her breath that she did not appear to be aware of. He came home to Joseph, who grew into an energetic, curious child with his mother's talent for observation and his father's stillness when something caught his full attention. He ate meals at a table that had conversation at it, and went to bed at night with warmth beside him that was real and chosen and permanent. Winifred's practice grew. By 1886, she had produced maps that were in use by the Territorial Survey Office, 2 mining companies, the Army's quartermaster department, and the new railroad survey teams that were beginning to assess routes through the southern ranges. She was acknowledged in the cartographic community, which was a small community with high standards and a previous reluctance to acknowledge women in it that was slowly, through the quality of the work, being overcome. She received a letter from a cartographer in Philadelphia who had seen her work through the survey office and who wrote with professional admiration that she read to Nathan in the evenings, and then filed carefully in the document case, adding to a collection of professional acknowledgments that were growing thick. He watched her receive these with the same matter-of-fact precision with which she received everything, and he thought sometimes about the survey company owner who had removed her name from her maps, and about all the other small and large injustices that had been placed in this woman's path, and about the way she had moved through every one of them with her head up and her eyes open, mapping the terrain of the world's resistance to her existence in it on exactly the terms she required, and then moving forward anyway. In 1887, they had a second child. A daughter this time, Eleanor Aloysia Hudson, named for no one specific except that Eleanor had been Winifred's grandmother's name, and Aloysia was so obviously right that it required no discussion. Eleanor arrived with considerably less drama than Joseph had, being a more organized child from the beginning, which Winifred observed with the satisfaction of a scientist seeing a predicted result. She was dark-eyed like her mother and had Nathan's serious expression, which on an infant of 6 months was somewhat comically incongruous and delighted him every time he saw it. Thomas Runs Deer, who had recovered fully from his fever of 1883 and continued to be Nathan's most trusted source of knowledge about the mountains, visited the Hudson household regularly and had established something close to a grandfather's relationship with both Joseph and Eleanor, bringing them occasionally to the river and teaching them to read the ground in the way he had taught Nathan, though with considerably more patience than Nathan had required because they were, after all, children. Joseph took to it with the focused seriousness of a 7-year-old who has decided that a thing is important. Eleanor, at 3, mostly ran toward the interesting tracks and sat down in them, which Thomas considered its own kind of engagement. Silas Harlan had been tried in Springer in the fall of 1883 and sentenced to 30 years in the territorial prison in Santa Fe. 6 of his men received sentences of varying length. 3 of them, including the young one who had stayed inside the building, were sentenced to shorter terms on the grounds of age and reduced involvement. And the young one, whose name was Jerome Calloway, and who was 20 and genuinely seemed to understand the gravity of what he had been part of, was released after 2 years and wrote Nathan a letter thanking him for the relative mercy of the arrest, which Nathan showed to Winifred and which she read carefully and then set on the table between them with the quiet expression of a person filing information in its proper place. "What do you think?" Nathan asked. "I think he meant it," she said. "People generally sound different when they don't mean it. Do they tell you that in the military manuals?" he asked. "No," she said. "That one I worked out myself." In 1889, New Mexico moved closer to statehood, and the political landscape of the territory began to shift in ways that affected the Marshal's work. The growth of ranching and the expansion of the railroad, combined with the increasing settlement of the territory by farming families from the East and Midwest, was changing the character of the district in ways that Nathan found on balance positive, though not without complications. Land disputes that had previously been resolved by informal means were becoming legal matters requiring formal adjudication, and the violence that had characterized the territory's earlier years was slowly, unevenly, giving way to something more structured. He was reappointed to his marshal position in 1888 and again in 1891. By 1891, he had been in Cimarron for nearly 9 years, longer than he had stayed anywhere in his adult life, and the question of whether he was a man who stayed in places had been answered with a clarity he found surprising and comfortable in equal measure. Calvin Oates was promoted to Deputy Chief Marshal for the Northern Territory in 1890, which Nathan had recommended in a letter to Santa Fe. That was the most enthusiastic professional recommendation he had ever written. At Calvin's going-away gathering at the hotel, which the town turned out for with the warmth of a community sending off a genuinely beloved figure, Calvin made a brief speech that included a mention of the marshal and his wife that was oblique enough to maintain some dignity and specific enough to convey, to anyone who knew the story, exactly what he thought of both of them and of the combination. Winifred, sitting beside Nathan at the table, heard this and glanced at him sideways with that particular expression. "He's going to say something sentimental," she murmured. "He has been trying to say something sentimental for 8 years, Nathan murmured back. "He deserves to be allowed this one." Calvin, at the podium, said that the best thing that had happened in his professional life in Cimarron was working for a man who respected information more than assumptions, and that the best surprise of that professional life was discovering what information could look like when it arrived in a form nobody expected. He raised his glass. The room raised their glasses. Winifred raised hers with a composed dignity, and Nathan raised his, and their eyes met across the table in that private communication that 8 years of marriage had refined into something nearly telepathic. Joseph Hudson was 9 in 1891, and in school 5 days a week at the Cimarron schoolhouse, which now had 2 rooms and 3 teachers, one of whom had arrived from Ohio in 1888 with a degree from a normal school, and had transformed the curriculum in ways that the children's parents found simultaneously impressive and overwhelming. Joseph was a serious student who excelled in geography and mathematics, and had a tendency to correct the teacher's maps when they contained errors, which he had been advised to do with more diplomacy, and which he continued to do with more directness, a quality his parents recognized with some resignation as genetic. Eleanor, at 6, had recently begun accompanying her mother on shorter field excursions, not the multi-day wilderness work, but the half-day surveys of accessible terrain that Winifred continued to do in the country immediately around Cimarron and along the river. Eleanor had her mother's notebook, a smaller one purchased specifically for her, and she filled it with marks that were, at 6, not quite maps but were unmistakably headed in that direction. Nathan came with them on Sunday afternoons when his work permitted, which was frequently enough to have become a family custom. The 4 of them, in good weather, would ride out along the Cimarron River to the Cottonwood Bend, where he had first seen Winifred reading tracts in the mud, and spread a blanket, and Winifred would produce the notebook she had been keeping since that first day, updated and expanded over 8 years. And she and Nathan would sit together and look at it, while Joseph and Eleanor investigated the riverbank with the focused energy of children who had been taught to look carefully at the world, and had decided this was an excellent way to spend an afternoon. On one of these Sundays in the summer of 1892, 9 years after the events in the valley, Nathan sat on the blanket in the cottonwood shade with Winifred beside him and the notebook open across both their laps, and he looked at the original pages from 1883, the maps of the gorge and the valley that were the beginning of everything, and then he looked at his wife's profile, the jaw and the cheekbone and the careful precision of the way she looked at things. And he thought about a woman crouching in the sand and drawing a map with a stick and changing the shape of his life completely. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, without looking up. "The beginning," he said. It was quiet for a moment. "The beginning was me in the mud," she said, "reading somebody else's horse tracks." "The beginning was you on your knees in the sand outside the jailhouse," he said, "drawing a map I had spent 3 years making sure nobody knew." She looked at him. "You were very shocked," she said. "I was completely shocked," he said. "I would like to say I recovered my composure quickly." "You did not," she said, with the slightly fond precision she reserved for truthful assessments of people she loved. "No," he agreed, "I did not. He paused. "I have never recovered my composure where you are concerned if I am being accurate about it. I simply became accustomed to operating without it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she took his hand in hers, not the tentative half-second contact of that first hotel doorway, but the full, easy, domestic certainty of a person who has held this hand through 9 years and considers it as fundamentally hers as the tools in the document case or the notebook on their shared lap. "Good," she said, which was her word, the same word she had said the first night at dinner when he said he needed her help, simple and full and absolute. Joseph called from the riverbank that he had found something, which turned out to be an interesting set of tracks, which Winifred rose to examine with the quick professional interest that never dimmed regardless of the age of the tracks or the familiarity of the terrain, because the terrain was never the same twice. She had told him once. It was always changing, always being written by the weather and the animals and the water and the people moving through it, always a new text, which was why it never got old. Elinor followed her mother to the bank, with the small notebook open. Nathan stood and stretched and watched his son explain the tracks and his wife examine them and his daughter take notes, and he thought that he had spent 3 years protecting a route through a mountain gorge, because he believed that the knowing of it would give him an advantage. And he had been right, and also entirely wrong about the nature of the advantage, because the advantage had not been the route itself, but the woman who had found it on her own. The woman who had crouched in the red dust outside his jailhouse and drawn it precisely in the sand, and looked up at him with those dark eyes, and changed the direction of every subsequent thing. He walked to the riverbank and stood beside Winifred and looked at the tracks with her, and she explained to Elinor what she was reading, and Joseph interjected with an observation that was correct, and that she confirmed with a nod, and the Cimarron River ran over the stones beside them in the summer heat, and the mountains stood in the east above the cottonwoods, and the territory was full of work yet to be done and seasons yet to come. "See the stride here," Winifred was saying to Elinor, her voice precise and patient. "Count the distance between the prints. That tells you the pace." Elinor counted, lips moving. "And here the depth of the front print versus the rear," Winifred said. "What does that tell you about where the animal was putting its weight?" Elinor thought about it. Nathan looked at his daughter thinking, 9 years old in a year, her mother's focused consideration already fully present in her face. "It was going uphill," Elinor said. "Going uphill," Winifred confirmed. "Good." Nathan caught Winifred's eye over their daughter's head, and she gave him the private smile, the one that meant all of it simultaneously, the beginning and the middle and this moment and everything still ahead, and he gave it back to her in his own way, which was less smile and more the complete absence of that careful professional reserve, the open face of a man who had stopped needing his composure, because what he had instead was something worth considerably more. They rode home to Cimarron in the late afternoon light, the 4 of them on the road along the river, and Joseph asked his father about the army that had passed through the territory the previous year, and what the soldiers had been doing in the mountains. And Nathan explained it in the careful, factual way he explained things to his children, which was without simplification but with context. Because Winifred had strong opinions about the giving of incomplete information to young people on the grounds that incomplete information was how the majority of bad decisions in human history had been made. Elinor fell asleep on her horse in the way of small children who are practiced riders, swaying securely in the saddle with her notebook still clutched in one hand and her small face entirely at peace. Winifred reached over and steadied Elinor's horse's rein while she slept, a gesture so practiced it barely interrupted her conversation with Nathan about the mining commission she had received the previous week. Nathan looked at her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 9 years, with the attention of a man who has never fully adjusted to his own good fortune, who finds in the familiar face of the person he loves something that continues to be new because she was always new, always the next page of a text he would never finish reading, always the next bend of a route that had no end. "What is it?" she asked, without looking away from Alina. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She looked at him then. She looked at him in the evening light with the mountains behind her and their sleeping daughter's horse steady under her hand, and their son riding ahead on the road. And she did not say anything, because she did not need to, because they had been having this particular conversation for 9 years, and had long since moved past the need for words to carry the whole of it. They rode into Cimarron in the last of the light, and the windows of the houses were beginning to glow with lamplight, and the town that had been a place where Nathan Hudson arrived with a star on his coat, and a plan and a secret route, was now the place where he was home, where Winifred Wells had drawn a map in the sand that showed him the way through. The Cimarron River ran as it always ran, full of its own information, full of the language of terrain and time and water, and on the bank where a woman had once crouched in the mud reading the world's text with her fingertips, the summer grass grew long in the evening, and the cottonwood leaves turned silver in the last light, and the mountains in the east held their ancient patience against the darkening sky. Marshal Nathan Hudson rode home beside his wife through the streets of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1892, and the life he had was the life he chose and the life that had chosen him, complete and open and full of everything worth knowing.